The laughter bounced off the glass walls. It was that sharp, clean sound you only hear in places where no real work gets done. The salesman smoothed his Italian suit, looking at Frank like he was a stain on the polished floor. Frank didn't look up. He just rubbed his thumb over a knuckle that hadn't been cleaned since the Reagan administration. The contract on the table was worth $3 million. It was enough to save the company or bury it. But Frank wasn't asking for a lower price on the 2024 models. He was asking for a ghost. The salesman wiped a tear from his eye, thinking it was a joke. "You want us to check the archives for what?" he asked, his voice dripping with that fake patience they teach in business school. Frank finally looked up. His eyes were the color of cold steel. "I don't want a discount," Frank said. "I want the 1984 batch, and I want the ones you people threw away." Now you have to understand the difference between looking at a truck and seeing it. The salesman held a tablet. He saw horsepower ratings, torque curves, and warranty periods calculated by an algorithm in Silicon Valley. Frank saw the lie. He walked over to the display model, a gleaming beast of plastic and sensors. He didn't look at the sticker. He reached underneath the wheel well and tapped the frame rail with his wedding ring. Clink. It sounded hollow. It sounded like tin. It sounded like something that would fold the first time you asked it to do a real day's work. The salesman followed him, tapping his screen. He started talking about fuel efficiency and emissions compliance. He talked about the sensors that monitor the exhaust temperature to within a fraction of a degree. Frank stopped him. He pointed to a sealed black box near the manifold. "What happens when that sensor gets covered in road salt?" The salesman blinked. He didn't know. But Frank knew. The computer would panic. It would think the engine was dying, and it would cut the power to save the warranty, leaving a driver stranded in a blizzard with a perfectly good engine that was too smart for its own good. That is the disease of the modern age. We have replaced mechanics with part changers. A part changer plugs in a cable, reads a code, and replaces a module. They don't touch the metal. They don't smell the oil. They trust the screen more than their own hands. Frank wasn't a part changer. He was from a time when you diagnosed a misfire by feeling the vibration in the floorboards. He knew that efficiency is just a fancy word for cutting corners until the machine is too weak to survive a bad day. He turned back to the desk. "I don't want these disposable toys," he said. "I want the 1984 batch, specifically the ones from the Detroit plant, the ones with the casting defect." The salesman actually laughed again, but it was nervous this time. He tapped on his keyboard, pulling up the archives. "The 80s?" he asked, scrolling past pages of red text. "Sir, those were the Widowmakers. The factory poured the engine blocks too thick. They retained so much heat, they warped the head gaskets before the first oil change. We scrapped 90% of them. They are garbage." Frank leaned in, placing a heavy hand on the glass desk. "They aren't garbage. They are unfinished." See, the salesman saw a defect. He saw a mistake on a spreadsheet that cost the company millions. Frank saw iron. He saw an engine block so heavy it could anchor a battleship. He knew something the manual didn't. The factory called it a thermal failure. Frank called it potential energy waiting for a release valve. The modern trucks were built to the limit of the material. There was no room for error. The 84s were built with too much material. They were suffocating, yes, but they weren't weak. "I'll take the lot," Frank said. "Every single chassis you have rotting in the boneyard, and I'll pay scrap prices." The salesman looked at his boss, then back at Frank. He thought he was being pranked. He tried to steer Frank back to the 2024 model, explaining the heated seats and the lane assist technology. Frank didn't say another word. He just picked up his hat. He wasn't going to argue with a man who thought a truck was a smartphone with wheels. He turned his back on the air-conditioned silence, on the perfect paint, on the sensors that would fail the moment the temperature dropped below zero. He walked out the door, leaving the $1 million deal on the table. He didn't need a warranty. He needed iron that could hold a secret. To find the truth, you often have to leave the pavement. The dealership smelled like espresso and floor wax, a scent designed to make you sign checks. The salvage yard smelled like wet earth and oxidized iron, a scent that tells you what things are really made of. It was a 3-hour drive past the city limits, out where the cell service dies and the real world begins. Frank parked his truck at the gate. He didn't check in at the office. He walked straight to the back lot, past the rows of smashed sedans and twisted hybrids, to the corner where the heavy haulers went to die. There they were, 12 of them, the 1984 Detroit batch. To the untrained eye, they looked like failures. They were covered in moss, their tires were flat, and their cabs were faded by 40 years of sun. But Frank wasn't looking at the paint. He was looking at the casting numbers stamped into the block. See, in 1984, the foundry made a mistake that became a legend in the trade. The molds were set wrong. They poured the engine blocks with an extra quarter-inch of cast iron on the cylinder walls. The engineers called it a catastrophe. That extra metal held on to heat like a cast iron skillet. When the engine got up to operating temperature, the block would expand just enough to crush the head gasket. The factory recall was a disaster. The manual, that book written by people who don't get their hands dirty, said the solution was to install thinner, harder gaskets to resist the pressure. It didn't work. The trucks overheated, the heads warped, and the fleet was scrapped. They called them Widowmakers, because they killed companies, not drivers. But Frank knew something the manual missed. Iron is like wood. It needs to settle. It needs to season. These trucks had been sitting in the rain and the snow for 4 decades. That thermal stress, the expanding and contracting of the seasons, had done the work that the factory oven couldn't. The metal was done moving. It was stable. It was dead cold and ready to be reborn. The flaw wasn't the metal. The flaw was that the engineers tried to restrain it instead of letting it breathe. He walked down the line, wiping the grime off a valve cover. He placed his hand flat against the block. It was freezing to the touch, dense and heavy. A modern engine block is mostly aluminum and air. It rings like a bell if you hit it. This was solid. It absorbed the sound. It felt like an anvil. He wasn't buying trucks. He was buying thermal mass. He was buying the one thing you can't manufacture in a clean room: density. The yard owner drove out in a golf cart, shaking his head. He sold the entire lot to Frank for the price of scrap metal. He thought he was robbing the old man. He even threw in the towing, probably out of pity. But the real battle wasn't the purchase. It was the timeline. Back at the depot, the board of directors was waiting. These were men who looked at spreadsheets, not engines. When Frank told them he had spent the equipment budget on 12 rusted hulks that hadn't run since the Berlin Wall fell, the room went quiet. They threatened to fire him on the spot. They told him he was risking the contracts, the drivers' jobs, and the company's future on a nostalgic delusion. Frank put a single rusted bolt on the polished conference table. "Give me until the first snow," he said. "If they don't run, you can take my pension." They gave him the deadline, but they didn't give him hope. They saw a pile of junk. Frank saw a fleet that was just holding its breath. Owning the iron was the easy part. Making it breathe required ignoring every single page of the service manual. Real surgery happens at night. During the day, the shop floor was a chaotic symphony of impact guns and shouting, a place where speed was the only metric that mattered. But when the sun went down and the junior mechanics went home to their video games, the bay became a sanctuary. Frank locked the doors. He didn't want anyone to see this. To a modern technician trained on plug-and-play modules, what Frank was about to do would look like vandalism. He wasn't going to replace a gasket. He was going to alter the architecture of the engine itself. He rolled the first engine block onto the stand. It sat there, a 600-pound monolith of black iron. Frank ran his hand over the side. It was cold, rough, and unforgiving. He picked up a center punch and a heavy ball-peen hammer. He didn't consult a schematic. The schematic was the problem. The schematic assumed the metal was perfect. Frank knew the metal was suffocating. He found the spot, a small flat ridge between the third and fourth cylinders, and struck it. Ping! A tiny silver divot appeared in the grime. This was the secret. The factory engineers had cast these walls almost an inch thick to handle the torque, but they forgot that iron needs to move. When the engine got hot, that massive wall expanded, but it had nowhere to go. It pushed up, crushing the gasket against the head. The fix wasn't a stronger gasket. The fix was giving the metal somewhere to go. Frank loaded a cobalt drill bit into the press. This wasn't a standard bit. It was sharpened to a specific angle, an old machinist trick for cutting hard metal without shattering it. He applied a drop of cutting fluid. The smell of sulfur and oil instantly filled the small circle of light. He pulled the lever. The bit met the block. The sound was a scream. It wasn't the high-pitched whine of drilling aluminum. It was a low, grinding protest. Cast iron this old is stubborn. It fights back. Frank had to feel the feed rate in his shoulder. Push too hard, and the block would crack, turning the engine into a boat anchor. Push too soft, and the bit would work harden the metal, making it impenetrable. He had to find the rhythm. He had to listen to the pitch of the cut. Curled shavings of dark gray metal fell onto the concrete. They were hot enough to burn skin. Frank didn't flinch. He drilled 4 holes, 4 relief ports that appeared on no blueprint. To the uninitiated, he was drilling holes in a perfectly good water jacket, but Frank knew the physics. These holes would allow the coolant to flow into the dead zones, the thickest parts of the casting that held the heat like a battery. He was turning the engine's greatest weakness, its density, into a radiator. He moved down the line, repeating the surgery on all 12 blocks. His arms ached. His eyes burned from the smoke of the cutting fluid. On the 7th engine, the drill bit caught a hard spot in the casting, a piece of slag left over from the foundry 40 years ago. The press shuddered violently. Frank froze. If the block cracked now, the vibration would propagate through the crystal structure of the metal, shattering the cylinder wall. He killed the power. Silence rushed back into the room, heavy and absolute. He placed his bare hand on the warm iron, right over the drill site. He closed his eyes. He wasn't praying. He was feeling for the frequency. A cracked block hums differently than a solid one. It feels dead. He waited. The metal cooled under his palm. It felt solid. It felt whole. He exhaled, a long breath that cleared the tension from his chest, and turned the drill back on. By 4 a.m., the surgery was done. The engines were reassembled, the heads torqued down not to the factory spec, but to the feel spec that accounted for the new relief ports. Frank wiped his hands on a rag that was more oil than cotton. It was time. He hooked up the batteries to the first truck. There was no laptop to boot up, no system check to wait for. He climbed into the cab, the seat springs creaking under his weight, and turned the key. It didn't whine. Modern trucks start with a high-pitched electrical whir. This didn't whir. It coughed, a deep baritone bark that shook the dust off the overhead lights. Then it caught. Thrum, thrum, thrum. The sound was physical. You could feel it in your teeth. It wasn't the frantic buzzing of a high-efficiency motor. It was the slow, rhythmic heartbeat of heavy industry. The idle settled into a steady lope. Frank watched the temperature gauge. It climbed to the middle and stopped. It stayed there. The metal was breathing. The Widowmaker was alive, and for the first time in 40 years, it wasn't running a fever. The winter didn't come in like a lamb. It came in like a foreclosure. It was the kind of cold that doesn't just freeze water, it changes the molecular structure of hope. The weathermen called it a polar vortex, but the mechanics called it the Great Silence. The temperature dropped to 40 below zero. At that temperature, diesel fuel turns into a cloudy gel that looks like Vaseline. Batteries lose their chemical will to live. And computers? Computers simply give up. The competitor's fleet was brand new. They had the contract for the medical supplies, the critical deliveries that had to get over the mountain pass. Their trucks were marvels of engineering, equipped with cold weather packages and heated fuel filters. But they had a fatal flaw. They were smart. When the temperature hit -30, the sensors on the intake manifolds read the air density and panicked. The electronic control units, the brains of the operation, decided that running the engine in such extreme conditions would risk damage to the turbochargers. So, to protect the warranty, the computers locked the ignitions. Drivers sat in freezing cabs, staring at screens that flashed operating temperature out of range. The trucks weren't broken. They were refusing to work. They were programmed to prioritize their own self-preservation over the cargo. The highway shoulder was littered with million-dollar paperweights, their hazard lights blinking weakly in the whiteout. Then came the rumble. Frank's fleet rolled out of the depot gates like a panzer division. They didn't have sensors to tell them it was too cold to work. They didn't have a safety mode. They only had mechanical fuel pumps and high-compression pistons. But the real test wasn't starting. It was the mountain. The pass rose 4,000 feet in 6 miles. The wind chill at the summit was enough to snap steel. As the convoy hit the grade, The drivers watched their gauges. This was the moment of truth. In a standard truck, the fuel lines running along the frame rails would be freezing. The diesel would begin to wax, clogging the filters and starving the engine. The drivers braced for the sputter, the cough, the silence. But the sputter never came. And this is where the flaw became the savior. Remember that extra quarter-inch of cast iron? The mistake that made the engines too heavy and too hot? In the summer of '84, it was a curse. But in the winter of the Great Freeze, it was a miracle. That massive slab of iron, drilled out by Frank's hand to circulate coolant, was acting like a thermal battery. It was generating and retaining a colossal amount of heat. The heat didn't just stay in the engine. It radiated. It soaked into the frame rails. It warmed the firewall. It created a microclimate under the hood that was 50 degrees warmer than the outside air. The fuel lines, routed close to the block, weren't carrying gelled sludge. They were carrying hot, thin diesel. The engines weren't just running, they were thriving. The density that made them obsolete was the only thing keeping the physics of the cold at bay. One of the drivers, a young kid who had laughed at the rust just a week before, looked out his window. He saw a brand new 2024 rig on the side of the road, the driver huddled in the cab wrapped in blankets. The kid looked down at his own floorboards. He could feel the heat radiating through the rubber mat. He wasn't driving a truck. He was driving a wood stove on wheels. He shifted gears, the transmission clunking with a satisfying, heavy mechanical thud, and the Widowmaker roared, pushing a wall of snow aside with its steel bumper. They climbed past the stalled technology, past the frozen sensors, past the warranty claims waiting to happen. They crested the summit in a cloud of black smoke and steam, a column of iron ghosts conquering the digital world. The delivery was made on time, but the cargo wasn't the point. The point was that while the smart machines were trying to save themselves, the dumb iron was busy doing the work. The sun broke over the depot, revealing a scene that defied the logic of the modern market. The competitor's fleet was being towed in on flatbeds, their high-tech sensors frozen into expensive bricks. The 1984 batch sat in a neat row, their engines ticking as they cooled down, the heat shimmering off their hoods like a mirage. That afternoon, a familiar Italian suit walked into the muddy yard. The salesman wasn't laughing this time. His shoes were ruined, and he looked like a man who had spent 3 days explaining to angry clients why their million-dollar investments couldn't handle a winter storm. He walked up to Frank, who was wiping down a fender with a rag that had seen better decades. "How?" the salesman asked. It was a simple question, but it carried the weight of a shattered worldview. "My phones are melting. Every fleet in the state is grounded. The ECUs froze. But your trucks, they didn't just run. They ran hot." Frank didn't answer immediately. He waved the salesman over to the open hood of truck 004. He pointed to the 4 small drill holes in the block, now sealed with threaded plugs. "You see that?" Frank asked. "That's where I let the ghost out." He explained the physics, how the modern engineers had optimized the metal out of the machine to save weight and fuel. They shaved every gram until the engine was efficient, yes, but fragile. The '84 batch had too much metal. That extra density, that flaw that caused the recall, was a thermal reservoir. "You built a machine to pass a test," Frank said, locking eyes with the man. "I built a machine to survive the world. You can't code resilience into a chip. It has to be cast into the block. We didn't survive because we were smarter. We survived because we were heavier." The meeting in the boardroom the next morning was short. There were no PowerPoint presentations. There were no projections. There was just the manifest of delivered cargo and a profit margin that made the accountants weep. The board members, the same ones who had threatened to fire Frank for buying junk, sat in silence. They looked at the numbers. Then they looked at the old man at the end of the table. They finally understood that their company wasn't saved by innovation. It was saved by memory. Frank never called them Widowmakers again. He took a paint marker and wrote a new name on the air cleaner of the lead truck. The Iron Lung. Because when the world choked, these were the only machines that could still breathe. And they kept them running. Not with diagnostic scanners or software updates. You won't find an OBD2 port on these rigs. Every Sunday, Frank walks the line with a mechanic's stethoscope. He places the cold probe against the warm block and closes his eyes. He isn't looking for a code. He is feeling for the rhythm. He listens for the valve lash, for the main bearings, for the deep, resonant song of the combustion. He teaches the young mechanics that machines don't have secrets. They just have languages we stopped bothering to learn. Frank sat on the bumper of truck 001, watching the steam rise off the hood in the morning light. He took a sip of coffee that was as black and bitter as the oil he worked with. Progress, he realized, isn't always about new chips or faster processors. Sometimes, progress is just remembering what iron feels like when you stop trying to control it and start listening to it. If you know a machine that refuses to die because you learned its secret language, maybe a tractor that outlived the farm, a lathe that built the factory, or an old truck that runs on spite and prayer, tell us its story in the comments. We want to hear about the iron that the world forgot. Subscribe to the Forgotten Manual for more stories from the shop floor. The manual is just paper. The truth is in the iron.